Hello students. Today this lecture is on positive feedback. And earlier we had talked about negative feedback. I'm now going to talk about positive feedback. Positive feedback is very different from negative feedback. If you remember with negative feedback, one of the key points I made was that in negative feedback, the response was always opposite the stimulus. And so we used the example of body temperature. My body temperature starts to rise. Negative feedback kicks in and lowers my body temperature. So the response is opposite the stimulus. In positive feedback, it's much different. In this case, in positive feedback, the response exaggerates the stimulus. The response adds to the stimulus. By the way, positive feedback is very rare. Negative feedback is very common. Almost all of our physiological systems are controlled by negative feedback. Positive feedback is very rare. In fact, the only two examples that I can think of is one is in labor contractions during birth, and the other is in blood clotting. If we look at that just a little more closely, here is negative feedback, where I have this oscillation around a particular set point. It could be body temperature, blood pressure, blood glucose levels. But though that particular physiological parameter is maintained around a certain set point, but there is a small oscillation around that. In positive feedback, very opposite. In positive feedback, I have a stimulus that raises something, and that creates a response that raises it even more, and that creates a response that raises it even more, and raises it more, and raises that physiological parameter variable even more. The classic example of that is labor contractions during birth. And that the woman starts to undergo labor, she starts to have contractions, those contractions cause more contractions, and those contractions cause even more contractions, and finally even more contractions, and finally enough contraction where birth actually occurs. And that's a classic example. Another example is in blood clotting. In this case, I have a tear in a blood vessel wall, and I initiate a positive feedback cycle where platelets and chemicals migrate and work towards the site of the blood vessel tear. And as those platelets and chemicals go to that tear in that blood vessel wall, they attract even more chemicals and even more platelets. And those platelets attract even more platelets until finally I have a blood clot. If we take just a look at that in a little more detail, again, I have a break in the blood vessel wall, I have a tear, and I have bleeding. I initiate a positive feedback cycle. And as I initiate a positive feedback cycle, the positive feedback cycle, what I'm doing there is that there are chemicals released from that tear in the wall that are attracting platelets. They're also attracting white blood cells. And as those platelets are attracted to this site, the platelets attract even more platelets. And those increasing platelets, they attract even more platelets. And platelets continue to attract it to that break in that blood vessel wall until finally there are so many platelets that a blood clot is formed. And then there is no longer any damage, and then the feedback cycle ends. So that is positive feedback, very different from negative feedback. In positive feedback, the response always exaggerates the stimulus. And the two classic examples are labor contractions during birth and blood clotting. Thank you.